This podcast is brought to you in partnership with EVA International Media Limited. Hello and welcome to Down to Earth with Terry Virts, where we talk about what matters on planet Earth. And if you love the podcast, please subscribe and give us a rating. Today, we have a very cool guest, Maciej Ceglowski. Maciej is an ex-painter and computer guy per his self-described bio. He has an amazing blog on the website idlewords.com, and he wrote one recently about why we should not send send humans to Mars, and that intrigued me. So we're going to discuss that today. It's the old robots versus humans argument, and very prolific writer. So Maciej, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you're real quick about your background, that your name is not exactly a normal, it's not Joe Smith.
Right. It is a Joe Smith in Poland, where I'm from. So I came over with my mom when I was a little kid to the States. We kind of got trapped here as tourists because of political upheaval. And then, it turned out for the best.
Yeah.
So I spent many years trying to be an artist, and that kind of funneled me into more desperate forms of web design, where I kind of learned I had an aptitude for tech things. So I became one of those reluctant tech people that come in from the arts. But I've also been fascinated with how all the changes in technology affect our day-to-day lives, how human psychology plays into it. So I've had one foot out the door in a tech career for maybe 20 years now. I support myself with a one-person business called Pinboard. That's a bookmarking website, and I nerd out about things I really am interested in my ample free time. So that's how I got here.
Well, it's amazing. And so if I Googled, or I was looking you up on LinkedIn, and you're right, there's a lot of Maciej Ceglowskis. It's an amazing thing. Do you get back to Poland very often? I love that country, by the way. It's one of my favorite places in the world.
Yeah, mine too. I'm glad you've been there. Since my dad died about 6 years ago, I used to go regularly, and that kind of removed the main reason. It's also been politically, just more and more depressing there. Kind of the same dynamic that we've seen in the US has played out even more, acutely in Poland, and especially in like forms of hyper religious nationalism. And it just makes me reluctant to go and see with my own eyes how my beloved country has changed.
Yeah, the right wing has definitely taken root. Hungary is probably the worst example of that, but
very analogous situation.
Yeah, hopefully, I think I was just on a podcast with a Ukrainian on her podcast, and I hope this war has pulled our head out of the sands in a way that will be good in a lot of ways. I hope so. We'll see how that plays out. But anyway, so you're based here in America for a long time. You must have a lot of spare time, because this article that I wrote, that I read, and I forgot the title of it. I have it. I'll call it up.
It was called "Why Not Mars?"
Why Not Mars? It was 8,000 words, including the citations, which are massive. It's like a well-written scholarly article. That's a lot of word. That's like, I got my book here, How to Astronaut. That's like 2 chapters in my most recent book.
Well, I think I have 60,000. It's not a 5-minute read. I think there's like another 60,000 words still in the can about different specific topics. Anything to do with space. Once you pull on one of the strings, you just go further and further into other areas of detail. That's a big danger of writing about this kind of stuff.
Well, that's a book. That's not an essay. If you've got 60,000 words, you should talk to a publisher. That's my National Geographic View from Above book was only 40,000 words.
The problem is only about 10,000 of those are good words. My writing style is, to blast and then cut.
Stephen King wrote a great book. I'm not a Stephen King fan, but when I started writing about 5 or 6 years ago, somebody said you need to read. It's called On Writing, a Memoir of the Craft, I think. And it is a spectacular book about how to write. And so you know what I'm talking about. His advice is write it down and then cut it all, which is good advice.
It's a great book to read, whether or not you write fiction, nonfiction. It's the man knows how to write. He's a process.
A good storyteller. Yeah. The man is very good. So let's talk about Mars. Let's just dive right into it. By the way, the photos you have on that website on your blog, idlewords.com, right? Um, is those are cool photos. They're all taken by robots, obviously, and they're all highly
Yeah.
photoshopped. Like, I hate to break it to you, but when you see a Hubble picture, it's photoshopped. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
I recommend people go to the HIMARS website where all the really good imagery is from, because they show you the kind of Photoshop version, but also the raw
the
data in
raw
different
data,
forms.
which is often
And
black and white, depending on the
yeah,
sensor. Yeah,
yeah. So I wanted those photos in there because to me at least, they restore that sense of deep weirdness, and that like this is really another planet. It's not just another like orange sandbox, but this is a strange and odd other world. So that's what
it
drew me
really
to them,
is.
and yeah.
Yeah. Flying through the aurora, the southern, well, it's seeing the northern lights way off to the north, but flying through the southern lights, the aurora australis, made me think it was alien. Like, this is not,
Mm.
it's so alien, it's so unearthly.
Mm.
But so you
I
have
like
some
that you go
arguments.
right to stick it in my face that you've been to space. Damn it, and I haven't.
Well, but if we follow your advice, you'll never get to space.
Yeah, so there's an element of like, why should anybody get to go if I can't go in my
Yeah.
in my
You
ranking?
know, here's one of my arguments. And I think we're going to agree about a lot of stuff. We're going to disagree about some
Mm.
stuff, but like, if you get married and you want to go to Hawaii for your honeymoon, you can go online and there's all kinds of amazing pictures of Hawaii and sunsets and stuff. Or you can go in person.
Yeah.
It's cool to see the pictures of it, but it's a whole nother level of experience about being there. But, and I think everybody would agree with that. But
Mhm.
I think the points that you're going to make are true, but at what cost? I can go to Hawaii for a couple $1,000s and have a nice week there, but the costs of going to Mars are a lot higher, and they're not only dollar costs, right?
Right, right.
So I'll let you lay out your argument, and I'll either agree or disagree.
Yeah, sure. So, like, the obvious argument, since you brought up cost, is everybody talks about how expensive this mission is. And I find that the least interesting and compelling one. If it was up to me, we'd just spend trillions of dollars on cool space
Right.
stuff all the time. So I'm not even going to mention that one. The one that really drew me to this topic is the scientific cost of potentially contaminating Mars. I didn't really used to care about this argument. I figured like either there's life on Mars and it's weird and arose independently, and we
Right.
won't it's impossible to confuse it with stuff that came from Earth, or there's nothing there and we'll just determine it. But I think recently the panspermia argument, the idea that there's a common, or if there's life or traces of past life on other worlds in the solar system, it is likely to be related and have a common origin with Earth. I think
Meteors
that
could have
argument,
brought organisms
yeah,
between
it could have
planets
arisen somewhere in our solar system. More exotic versions of the theory, it comes in from outside.
from a
But
comet.
basically,
Yeah.
we've learned that stuff can survive for a really long time in cold rocks,
Mhm.
and that these rocks are exchanged very prolifically, at least within the inner solar system. So there's this chance that we have a common origin with whatever might be left or traces of past life on Mars, and that we can make our work as scientists more difficult by overlaying that with some more recently arrived, hitchhikers on a spacecraft.
Mhm.
And that question is one of those that the closer you look at it, the more troubling it becomes. It's easy to dismiss kind of on a superficial level, but the details are important, and it gets pretty bad. So that's the scientific cost of the Mars mission. And then there's also the opportunity cost.
Yeah.
Like let's pretend we're talking about the space shuttle in like 1968. We can argue about the merits of hypersonic space planes, but we can also talk about what is the specific hypersonic space plane that we're going to get, given budget realities, given political realities, given the fact that space nerds are always going to be a minority of tax-paying society. And I think that we've now, in 1968, that argument would have been different, but now we've had two projects, the ISS and the space shuttle, that promised one thing and delivered something completely different, and a lot more constrained and kind of frustrating than what we would have dreamed of. And I think that Mars would be the same way. The mission that you would get to Mars would be extremely frustrating, even to the biggest booster. Unless you believe that Elon Musk is going to be able to fulfill all his promises about doing it cheaply and colonizing it. The NASA Mars mission is going to take a long time. It's going to be way over budget, and it is going to be much, much less cool than you think it is, at the price of 40 years of not exploring the solar system, with these revolutionary new technologies that we have
Right.
now, and at the price of potentially contaminating the greatest scientific experiment that we have.
Those are two super important arguments. And the contamination is one I think that very few people think about. And NASA thinks about it, and they the probes that we send to Mars are sterilized intensively. And but what might happen, describe a little bit more the threat of contamination, and B, describe the difference between Perseverance or Sojourner, or one of these rovers, and a human. So there's two
Yeah.
questions. What might happen bad, and why are having humans there different than having robots there?
Of course, I'll take them in the opposite order because I think that'll make it clear. So right now, all of the rovers on Mars, except probably Viking, they're not sterilized in the way we think of it. They have microbes on them, inside them, that are probably still viable. And in a sense, the cleaning process almost selects for microbes that are going to do well on Mars.
Right.
One of the ways we discovered new microbes was by examining these landers after they'd been cleaned and finding out, oh, this, here's the bacterium that actually eats the ethanol we thought was killing it. But those are kind of lone survivors clinging to a log in the sea, if you think of it metaphorically. What a human mission would bring would be kind of a very complex biome, including like our gut bacteria, all the stuff that lives in the spacecraft, all the stuff that interacts with us. And when you take high school biology, you learn about evolution working through natural selection, that you have organisms that are more or less fit, and then the ones that are less fit die off, and the ones that are more fit reproduce. And that's the process where you get adaptations. But prokaryotes have a different mechanism called horizontal gene transfer, where they actually kind of exchange genes with each other like Pokemon cards. If you look at how antibiotic resistance spreads so quickly, that's an important mechanism. The point is that if you have a diverse microbiome, then all of that genetic potential is easily traded, and you can get organisms. Obviously, a spacecraft is not going to contain the bacteria that are thriving 4,000 meters below the Earth. That's their home. They're not coming up to Johnson Space Center to get on the capsule. But in a broad sense, that capability is there in the genome. And if you have a lot of different species that are in a very warm, wet, food-rich environment on Mars, they have many chances to find a way to adapt to whatever niche they find. And human activity outside of a spacecraft, there's just no way to make it kind of a biosafety level 4 sort of experience. Spacesuits leak, the hatch leaks every time you open it, the spacecraft is big, you can't sterilize it, all of these
Spacesuits
things
leak by design. There's a sublimator that at least on ISS, it shoots water out into space. I mean, that's what spacesuits do. And there's purge valves that let the air go out. And so, by design, they leak a little bit, a very small amount. But
so you're basically putting a leaky terrarium on the surface of Mars if you send humans. And
those organisms, I think what you just said, I'm just a fighter pilot, but I think you said they can interact with each other and advance genetically, like they can mutate and turn into other things by the nature of biology.
Yeah, they like bacteria will just kind of line up next to each other and trade a few genes. And the process isn't very well understood, but it gives them a lot of opportunities without waiting to like evolve into stuff, to just trade genetic capability. So that's kind of the big difference between rovers that have a couple of survivors on them and this big leaky terrarium that we're talking about with a Mars landing. As far as consequences, we should talk about two different ones. One is the consequence for the mission of having to design around what they call biosafety. And even if you don't believe that this, or don't care that this is a risk, like because NASA has to care and is obligated by treaty to care, it constrains the mission enormously. It prevents astronauts from being able to touch samples even in the lab that they've taken. It prevents them from going to all of those sites that are of most scientific interest, which are called, special regions,
where there's like potentially water underground.
Right. The dynamic phenomena like the stripes that form on dunes, caves. It prevents them from drilling. It actually prevents them from going more than 5 meters deep, which is a problem when you're trying to radiation harden the shelter you've built. So even if you don't care about the consequences, the rules that it imposes are massive, and they basically will we'll turn this into a sample return mission where someone can do remote control robot stuff from the surface, but
Right.
not the thing that you want, which is a geologist and a biologist going out with
We do
shovels.
remote control robot stuff from JPL.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, I did
Yeah.
from the space station. I think this is the first and maybe only time. My buddy, he was a Mars scientist. He sent us some pictures, like a PDF package of some rocks, and we picked out a rock, and we were basically sort of not, helping to control the robot on Mars from the ISS, which is pretty cool.
That is pretty cool.
Yeah.
So the problem, of course, with that is you have the light speed time lag.
Yeah.
Like you can't
That's
just
a few minutes. Yeah.
So you have to plan an action, do it, plan it, and do it. And it would be cool to have it be live. So that's one of the arguments of having a operator on Mars or orbiting Mars. But it's not what we have in our imagination, which is basically Neil and Buzz out there, with a jackhammer getting cool stuff out of the ground.
Let's talk about Neil and Buzz real quick. Why don't we have these rules on the moon? Planetary protection rules or biosafety rules?
We did to some extent. If you look at there was certainly concern about bringing stuff back that would.
Yeah,
yeah. But if you look at the Mars plans at that time, they're really interesting. Like Werner von Braun's plan just assumed there would be life on Mars. What he most wanted to do was bring a lot of plants and see if we could grow anything there. And they just kind of thought, whatever life we find on Mars, we'll shoot it and try to get it in the spacecraft if it's small enough, to mount it in the Smithsonian. So there was a very different. I think you have to understand that there was a real big revolution in our understanding of microbes in that intervening period that made it much of a more sensitive issue. And then also, to be honest, a growth in bureaucracy where everything has to be committed to death, including, COSPAR is this vast organization that determines planetary safety rules with whatever many number of international participants.
What organization is that?
A COSPAR. So that's it's been around since the 50s, and so there's this International Space Treaty in 1967, and then COSPAR is the international scientific body that, among other things, decides what the specific implementation of that rule is.
Okay.
But it's something on space, International Committee on Space Research, something of that flavor.
Okay. Do they name satellite? There's all satellites get number, like objects in space get numbers. Is that a COSPAR number? I've seen the acronym. Mm-hmm. I never knew what they were exactly.
I don't know if they have a lot of different jobs. I don't know. That might be one of them, or that might be one of the other many acronyms. But
to your point, you don't want to contaminate. You don't want to leave Earth life there because A, who knows what it's going to turn into, and B, that kills our ability to understand if there was Mars life, right?
Right.
They might turn into some monsters or something, or they might. Or the more likely thing is that we'll go, we discovered life. And it's like, no, you just discovered some bacteria from the guy's poop from the last mission.
Right. Like the way I like to put it is right now we have an answer on Mars about the origin of life on Earth. And it might be a negative answer. It might be an entirely dead, sterile planet that has no trace and had never had life from anywhere.
Right.
It might be a planet that had its own form of life arise that is different from ours biochemically. Or maybe it uses the same biochemical things, but invented it independently. Or it might have a common origin with Earth life because it came from a meteor that launched off of Earth, or vice versa, or from Venus, or God knows from where. So the answer is there right now for sure. And the only question is, how do we go collect it without ruining our ability to ever find it? The worst case scenario is that something from the spacecraft finds its way outside of the spacecraft, then into a habitable niche somewhere where there is still relic life from Mars, deep in a cave maybe, where geothermal heat is enough to sustain life. Right. And that these organisms are similar enough that they're able to do some sort of gene exchange.
Right.
And at that point, we never know what a pristine Mars organism looked like or not. This is a far-fetched scenario, but not incredibly far-fetched. It's kind of medium far-fetched.
It's not zero probability.
Yeah, and it's not 0.0001, but it's also not 80% probability.
Right, exactly. But the consequences are humanity never understands life on Mars. The consequences are permanent. It's like climate change is bad, but extinction is worse. Like
Right.
That climate change is going to end in a few centuries. Extinction is forever, and so
Yeah, kind of precluding anybody in the future from being able to find this out is a
yeah,
big deal. And my argument is like, if you're going to put astronauts on Mars, you have to have a reason that's good enough to run this risk, whatever it is. We can argue
right,
about what the risk is, but
right.
you need at least like a positive argument for it.
What's the return on investment? I want to talk about that here shortly. But let's get
Yeah.
back to the moon. We're sending.
Mm.
I don't know when we're going to actually send people to the moon. If you've seen, uh, anyway, it's not going to happen next year. But we don't worry about this. This is not an argument that I've ever seen. People talk about the cost, people talk about the benefits, but no one
Mhm.
talks about planetary protection on the moon. Is that because we don't think there's life there and it's so inhospitable? I think Apollo 12 landed next
Mhm.
to a probe, Ranger or lunar
Surveyor, yeah, yeah.
surveyor, and they brought it back and they found bacteria on it.
Yes.
That's the urban legend that I've heard. So why are we not worried about this on the moon?
There are people that are worrying about this and are trying to ring the bell. The problem is that once you start saying, "Hey, what about the moon?" then you're basically precluding human spaceflight anywhere, because
Well,
the
to
moon,
orbit.
yeah, you can go to orbit, but you can't land on anything, because if you're worried about the moon, then any comet or any uh, asteroid is going to be more hospitable than the moon. The argument about it is it's quite good. It's like we don't really actually know what life is, how it travels, where it survives. So let's
Right.
be prudent. Um,
But
but
how about
yeah,
this argument? It's life. Life explores and expands.
I'm more sympathetic to that. Like the moon is there,
Yeah.
it's not Mars. You have to like really pick up and go.
Yeah.
The moon is ours.
Yeah.
It sits in our
Okay.
orbit.
Right.
It makes sense that we want to go there. If someone can make a compelling case that there's like moon animals that we're gonna destroy, but I don't want to. I'm not a doctrinaire about this. I just think it's a balance of risks, right? With the moon, it's much easier to go. The scientific benefit perhaps is really big. Like you can build huge telescopes on the far side,
Yeah.
and the likelihood that Earth life could be confused for moon life seems very low to me.
Yeah.
If someone shows me evidence that that's wrong, I'll change my mind. But right now, that's kind of my gut feeling. And I know very little about lunar
But
exploration,
we
to be
want to
honest.
go to where there's water on the moon, and there's a good
Yeah.
chance that there is frozen water buried under the soil in some
Yeah, but I
crater.
got frozen water in my freezer. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not really
Well,
sure that I understand why we're going back to the moon, even.
well, we can talk about that too. That's a great
Mhm.
question, actually. W- but the the bigger question of, should you protect the moon or not? I don't know. That's something that we just haven't heard. And I guess
Mhm.
the one argument is we own it, and the other argument is probably not likely that there's life there. Um, but that's the counter argument that I was trying to make is, well, even if we infect a planet, that's fine because that's what life does. Like life, that's what life does. It expands. It might be through a meteor, it might be through a spaceship. Some
Mhm.
people might say that's just part of evolution, is life growing and expanding.
Yeah, I would even accept that argument and say like go to Mars, build cities, whatever you want to do. It's just that we have a chance before that happens to collect really important information that we get one shot at.
So
So if we
maybe
ruin
what
that
you're saying
chance,
is,
let's
oh, sorry,
make a
Mitchell.
case for it. Oh,
Uh,
sorry.
So maybe the right answer is, let's give us a period of time where we do an intensive collection of life or not life. Let's figure out what's there.
Right.
And then once we're satisfied, then let's go explore.
Yeah, and my model for human exploration is actually, if you look at the technology we have, Mars is about as far as we can get. We can go to Mars and Venus, given reasonable, even with infinite money right now, just with given the technical limits of life support, of propellant, of propulsion, all these things. If you send probes out to the Jovian moons and you find a wrecked starship, or there's whales under the European surface,
Right.
that creates a reason to find technological ways to send people much further afield. To me, that's the path to, if you want to go to the stars, is to start with robots, make
Mhm.
discoveries that compel you to send people. And the thing I truly take issue with is this idea that human spaceflight is an end in itself and we should just be doing it because it's worth doing. Let's create reasons to need it, and then we'll have much more social and government support for the enormous amount of money you have to spend to make it work.
One of the arguments is single planet species don't survive. Well, we don't know that to be true.
Right.
One of the things that I found from being in space, just looking back, this blue, thin blue line. I've got some photos in my studio here. It is thin. And like every human that's ever been is from below that line, and no human that ever has been or ever will be really is from above that line. And when you look at Mars, I've had a guy named James Head. He's a PhD at Brown University astronomer. We talked about, we did 3 or 4 podcasts about all the planets, from Mercury out to the Oort cloud. And there's nowhere else in the solar system that humans will ever live without a spaceship or a spacesuit. You're not going to terraform Mars because there's no magnetic field. And so whatever atmosphere 1,000 years from now we put in there will get stripped away by the solar thing. So there's nowhere else that we can live, I think. And so that argument of being a multi-planet species, and there are other planets in the universe for sure. We're finding there's probably billions of other planets, and there's probably a bunch of other Earths, but they're so far away, we're never going to get there. Like, we're never going to get there. And so we are a single planet species, and that won't change. And so we need to protect the planet we're on. That's my reality check.
Yeah, I like Earth. You know, all my stuff is here. My friends are here.
Yeah,
the food is good.
The food's pretty good. Yeah,
yeah. And I think another thing about the multiplanetary species thing, you really start getting into psychology of people on Earth, who, even if you believe that we need to spread to other planets, like, what's the rush? Why do we have to do it on such a short time scale? You begin to talk more about psychology and sociology of what makes people tick on Earth than actually talking about Mars or space anymore. I think that's a big factor.
What would it be like to live on Mars? Where are you right now, by the way? Where are you based?
I'm in northern New Mexico. I'm near Los Alamos.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you see a green glow,
I was going to say, turn the lights off and you'd be glowing in the dark. That's a nuclear research facility there. One of my favorite astronauts, a good friend of mine, Don Pettit, was a research scientist there at Los Alamos.
I know a lot of astronauts have come through. There's that wonderful set of oral histories, including your friends, that that are just a goldmine for space nerds. And there's a lot of people who talk about going through Los Alamos at some point.
It's cool. I learned how to land the shuttle in New Mexico at the White Sands missile range. But how would life be? Imagine landing on Mars. And I've been out to JPL. I was there when they discovered the blueberries 20 years ago, you know, the evidence of previous standing water on Mars. But it just seems like a really miserable place to live to me.
And that kind of ties into the open questions. Like, well, first of all, to your point of it being miserable, people talk about these Mars analogs on Earth, like the Atacama Desert, you know, or the dry valleys in McMurdo. The Mars analog, the real Mars analog on Earth, is you take a walk-in freezer to 80,000 feet and you put a UV lamp in there, and that's kind of your Mars analog. So I think the fact that it has an atmosphere and
with a bar of plutonium next to you.
Yeah. The fact that it has an atmosphere and the photos come out looking kind of Earth-like tends to distract from just how hostile an environment it is. But it ties into 2 of these open questions too. Is one of them is like, is the gravity there strong enough to keep you from kind of weakening progressively over time, losing your eyesight, you know, getting brittle bones? And the other is the radiation hazard. Like, just, do you have to live in a cave? How long can you spend out on the surface?
Right.
So those are both open questions right now. And if the answers are bad, then life on Mars means you're living underground and you're working out, or you're on a centrifuge 2 hours a day.
Well, the radiation is a problem. I mean, and that's bad. Mars has a thin atmosphere, which will help a very little amount. Like you said, 80,000 feet, it's like 1% of Earth's pressure. So it's almost no atmosphere at all. If you took your helmet off, you'd die instantly, just like you would on the ISS.
Right.
And there's no magnetic field. So the magnetic field is what makes the northern and southern lights, which is a good indicator of why we have life on Earth. And there's no ozone layer, which protects you from UV. So there's lots of different radiation challenges that are a problem. And so life on Mars is probably going to be, like you said, living in a cave or living in some type of shielded, protected thing. The gravity doesn't worry me that much. I was in space for 200 days. I worked out. They gave us 2.5 hours a day. So I took a vitamin D pill because you're not getting UV to make vitamin D. And I lost 0.0% of my bone density.
Oh,
Now
good.
I changed your leg. I got little skinny legs. I was kind of buff. It was like going on a health spa. There's no McDonald's and I was working out 2.5 hours a day. But and that was in weightlessness. So I don't know. You can't say, I'm not a scientist. I can't say for sure, but my gut feeling tells me the gravity is the least of our problems. I think radiation is much, A, you have some gravity, and B, you work out, and I think you'll be in good shape. But the lack of radiation shielding, in my mind, is a lot worse. And the other problem is, can your life support equipment last that long? Like a broken toilet could kill the crew.
Yeah,
So
but
really,
I want to loop back to the exercise bit though. Your requirement when you were in space, you were doing like 2 or 2.5 hours a day of exercise, right? That was and that's like resistive and then treadmill or bike stuff.
Exactly.
So like one of the things is, we talk about gravity. It's not just about whether your bones are going to get brittle or your eyes are going to deteriorate, but do you need like this exercise equipment on the Martian surface? Is hypergravity enough? Because it has a couple of problems. One is it really eats into the available time.
Yeah.
When every crew member has to be using this stuff 2.5 hours a day, on top of all of the, it takes more time to do everything in space.
Right.
And your time on Mars is the most precious time you have. You've spent all this money to get people there. So what can we cut? The other thing is that you have a very limited amount of mass and a very limited volume that you can land on the Martian surface. The aeroshell is a certain shape. And then if that has to include exercise equipment, it not only means that there's more mass, but the life support system has to be more robust because people are going to be breathing more and eating more.
Right.
So there's all these like follow-on effects of the gravity being an unknown.
Right.
If we had the answer of just like how much can we get away with in through 0.38 gravity, it would make things a lot easier.
But you're right, but even on Earth, you exercise. I mean,
speak for yourself, brother.
I not enough, but every once in a while I get up from my desk and go walk into the kitchen to eat. So, but so in other words, you could probably bring it back to Earth like exercise, but you still need the equipment, and that equipment breaks. We had to repair the treadmill sometimes, and we had to repair the workout machine, and you're going to have, hopefully you'll have nuclear powered electric propulsion to get you there quickly, but you're going to have months in weightlessness that you'll have to exercise also. And so there's a cost to it. You're going to have hundreds of kilograms of equipment and hours of time of exercise. So that eats into, if the country is going to commit to $100 billion to get 1,000 hours of work, there's going to be hundreds of hours of work that comes away. So your hourly rate goes up because of exercise. That's for sure.
Yeah.
And the dollars per kilogram is pretty high too. I don't know if you've looked into that.
I haven't priced it out. I've only looked at what they call the gear ratios, like how many tons do you need in low Earth orbit to get 1 ton under that kind. Those are very, very scary.
Mass fractions are insane. I was talking to a good friend of mine at NASA who he actually is a rocket scientist. Most people are not. Most people are just like doing their job, whatever. He designed Gateway, actually. Headquarters told him that we're spending all this money on Orion and SLS and they don't have a mission, so come up with something. And he came up with Gateway. That was the genesis of Gateway. But he, at the time, he said it was 9 SLS missions to build the Mars ship that would have to go to Mars. And then he got kind of cranky. He's like, we could get it down to 7 or maybe less. But still, the flight rate of SLS is once every year. And according to the OG or IG, they're $4 billion mission, and that's just for the rockets. That's not for the stuff that goes in them. And so the time and money to build this thing, and then if you have one failure, you're going to have to build another one and blah, blah, blah. So it is a massive, expensive thing. And when I was writing my View from Above book, I was researching the cost of cargo to the ISS because everybody knows the space shuttle was super expensive and SpaceX is a lot cheaper. Until I did the research and I realized that SpaceX was the same cost as the space shuttle, dollars per kilogram.
Really?
And they just raised their price by 50% because they can, because they're a monopoly. And I would too. If I was the finance guy, I would raise the price. So, to get into Earth orbit, it's tens of thousands of dollars a kilogram. To go to the moon, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars per kilogram. But I just looked at the price of the weight or the mass of the rovers and the cost of the mission. It's like $1 million a kilogram to go to Mars. So I weigh, almost 100 kilograms. I told NASA I'd cut 20 pounds and split the difference, but they didn't take me up on that when I was on the shuttle mission. But in other words, there's a lot of zeros per kilogram of mass there. And to get it back, it's just like Apollo. The Apollo rocket was huge and there was this little tiny capsule, right? The only thing that came back was a small amount. So even though it's $1 million a kilogram to get it there, it's even more to bring stuff back. So without getting into the details, the cost of this human mission it's high.
It's high, and you also can't spend it the way you want. Like the best way to do it if you're going to go to Mars is to have like a ramp up period when you triple the NASA budget for a few years to get everything built. And
Apollo did that, by the way.
Apollo did that, and no one else is going to let them do it. So there's this additional constraint in NASA planning where everything has to fit into this cap of whatever
the 23 billion a year.
Yeah.
And that has to keep the lights on 10 different centers around the country. A huge army of
every congressional district has to be balanced, right? So it just makes this hard problem even more difficult, is how do you stretch this out? And then as we saw with the ISS and space shuttle, when you have such a long-term chronically funded program, everyone's going to want to redesign it until there's enough hardware built that it becomes a break. The shuttle reached this kind of fixed point where it was going to the space station and the space station was there for the shuttle, and you couldn't really change any of it. But that's like a bureaucratic dynamic. It has nothing to do with what's the best architecture for exploring all these things. It's just what can you get that is not cuttable.
We could talk for years about the bureaucracy of NASA. One of my last jobs at the astronaut office before I flew on my last mission I was the SLS guy. So SLS was Ares 5. Presidents changed. The new president didn't like the last president. They had to cancel, but they didn't cancel it. They kept it. They just changed the name. But there was this big bucket in funding because, like you said, they didn't ramp up the funding to get the rocket built in a 3-year period. They just did it, instead of focusing on it. And one of the solutions to fill in that gap of funding was they decided to use the space shuttle main engine, the RS-25, the same engine we used on the space shuttle, because they had like 14 of them laying around. We had all these space shuttle engines that we weren't using in space anymore. And that solved the problem for the first 3 SLS missions because we had free engines. But after that, we're using the most expensive rocket engine ever built, and we're throwing them all away on every flight. So
well, the engineers who designed this to be reusable are still alive, and I often wonder how they feel like watching all of that work go
to the bottom of the ocean. Now, maybe they'll have James Cameron could go down and salvage them. Which they've done, I think, with the F1. I think somebody got a Saturn V engine out of the Atlantic. But anyway, yes, the bureaucracy is not how to run a railroad, which is like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk. They've got their own money. They can do what they want to a certain extent. But Elon doesn't have his own. A lot of that money for SpaceX comes from the government. And so he does some amazing things for sure. But the bureaucracy is not the way to run a railroad. That's for sure.
I wanted to ask you, like, what you personally, what the astronaut corps, to your knowledge, think of Mars and think of how likely is it, when it'll happen? Is it a good idea?
We use a T-38 it's the best training that astronauts have because it's the one training that
you guys are so lucky.
We are, absolutely. But it's a jet. You're actually doing something. It's not just a simulator. And especially guys who aren't pilots, which probably 2/3 of the astronaut office is not pilots.
Mhm.
It's really good. So, but while we're flying a T-38, we talk about this stuff, and we would always talk about how do you get to Mars and how do you get to the moon and what should we do? This is always the thing. I think a lot of astronauts would love to go to Mars. They would volunteer to go. I think many of them realize that ain't happening anytime soon. One of the reasons I decided to leave NASA in 2016 was I knew the moon wasn't happening anytime soon, and I wasn't getting any younger, and there was other things I wanted to do in life. So, I think most people are realistic about it. Most people would probably promote it. And most of them would maybe haven't thought through the planetary protection issue, or, we get asked this question all the time. Why are we spending 20 billion or whatever billions on human spaceflight when you could be spending millions on robotics and learning more? I think that's a great question. When I was a kid, I was subscribed to Astronomy Magazine back in the 70s and 80s, and every month it would come, and that was when Voyager was happening. So I remember really well seeing Jupiter and Saturn and all these photos that were just incredible that humans had never seen before. And I love that stuff. And that's done for a fraction of the cost of what we.
Sometimes people that say that even NASA administration will say that only human spaceflight can inspire the next generation. I remember staying up all night watching the encounter with Neptune. Voyager was whenever that was in the 80s,
86, I think, maybe
89. 86. Younger people, Uranus was 86, right?
And Neptune was 89,
89, right. And then younger people will remember New Horizons, like the excitement of knowing that it had taken photos of Pluto. It was going to take a while to send them down.
Right.
So, these are really, really cool missions.
They are.
Even if there's no person on them.
Yeah, they are. And it's hard to justify. Now, in low Earth orbit, the cost is a lot less than on the moon or Mars. But I love the NASA robotic stuff. I love Hubble. I love James Webb. I went to Goddard and saw Webb after my last flight, and I immediately called the deputy administrator and said, "Hey, do you know that all these things have to? Do you know?" And he was like, "Yep, we know. Yep, we know." And so it's a miracle that it worked, because I was like, about 500 miracles have to happen in order for this thing to work, and they all did. So that's a good testimony to our engineers.
It was amazing.
Yeah, it's an amazing vehicle. Hopefully it lasts, because we can't fix it.
Right.
We need to get as many, the clock's ticking. They need to get as many images as quickly as they can. But I love these robotic exploration missions, and there's so many cool things to do, like a Europa mission. We're going to send an orbiter, but man, I wish we had a lander.
Yeah.
I wish we had a plutonium rod that would just sit there and melt through the ice and just slowly descend.
Right.
With a wire transmitter to let us know what's down underneath the ice of Europa. Venus, the Uranus and Neptune, we haven't been to since Reagan was president.
Just one flyby. That's all we know. Is the few photos shot in passing.
And I did a podcast about the moons of those gas giants, which are really cool. So I love robotic exploration, and that's the true exploration. In the 60s, we didn't have robots that were good. You had to send people. Robots weren't able to do the stuff they are now. They are able to do their stuff they are now. And so I love return on investment. I went to business school, and I think you really need to calculate that. And you also need to have this understanding of a sunk cost.
Yeah.
Sunk costs are sunk. You're never going to get them back. So just because you spent $100 billion on something doesn't mean you should spend another $1 billion on it. Politically, that's really hard. Mentally, that's really hard. If you're the baseball team that gave somebody a $400 million contract and the dude's 40 years old and sucks, he shouldn't be playing. If you want to win, you need to it's a sunk cost. You need to eat the cost and move ahead. And so I think that's something that is not always recognized in the space program.
But we're agreeing about too many things. Here we are. What are our big points of disagreement?
One of the things that I disagreed with you in your article, you talked about all the research that had to happen. And based on my time in space, I'm like, people can survive. Now, maybe they're going to be on crutches or something when they come back. I knew until recently, until my mom fell, I had known two people who had ever broken their hips, and they were both healthy Army officers who just came back from the space station, right? So there are, there are things. I've had several astronaut friends who've died from cancer. The eye problem, I don't think is a problem, and I'm directly contradicting thousands of NASA scientists. Everybody's your eyes change in space just because your retina changes, and you see better far away and worse close up. And mine returned when I got back to Earth. The vast majority of people's return when they get back. There's a couple people whose visual acuity is worse, like, but then again, they're in their 50s. Like a lot of people in their 50s need glasses. So
the eye problem is super interesting because like the structural changes are real and quite dramatic. Like there's
to the eye.
Yeah, the shape of the eye changes, there's swelling in the back, there's all these different changes that you can measure, but when you actually talk to people, like maybe your vision got a little worse, but that was the extent of it. And the big open question is like, what happens when you double and triple the time in space? Do these changes just continue to show up on tests but don't really affect astronauts, or is there some sort of is there a bigger process that we don't understand that's really and there's recent research that shows that there's an element of blood markers associated with brain damage and brainstem damage that go up, so there's all of this is due to fluids in the head, right? So that's but when you're talking about risk, like how do you evaluate it based on what we know, right?
We have rodent research. I did rodent research too, the second group for bone and muscle. We should do rodent research for just leave some mice up there for 3 years and see what happens to them. One of the biggest problem, again, eyes could be an issue, the brain, there's lots of issues. I met this lady at a conference in Norway a couple of years ago, and it turned out that she was doing this experiment on human brains. They were doing MRIs on brains, and I spent hours in the MRI before and after. I hated it. I really, my admiration goes out to people that can go in MRI machines, because those things suck. They're loud, they take forever, you're claustrophobic. And she was like, so it was all randomized data, but I told her, we figured out who I was. So she got her iPad out and she was like, oh yeah, your brain shifted. Like my brain moved 2 millimeters or something. And I remember when I got back, they're like, hey, we're running out of money. You don't have to go to the MRI anymore. And I was super happy because I hated that thing. And I said, well, is it back to normal? And she was like, I don't know. We ran out of money. So my brain actually shifted in my skull. So, there are these things, when men went to the South Pole 100 years ago, they died. And so there's some astronauts are willing to take some risk. You don't want to be killing off half of them, but those are the risks that all the other risks I agree with. I just think the research that you have to do is not, we don't need to spend 50 years studying weight loss or bone density loss. I would say, we got to figure it out, give them a workout machine and go.
I'm sympathetic all the other things, but
but
it affects mission design, right? Like I'll give you an example. If there's this problem of quiescence, like if you land on Mars and stay there for 17 months, your spacecraft is waiting for you in orbit empty. And it's very scary to go back and turn the lights on and everything still works. Bacteria haven't taken over the water system, that kind of thing. You really want to be able to leave someone up there or two people to just as caretakers.
Right. But Mike Collins, you need Mike Collins up there.
Yeah. But is it survivable? And that's just an absolutely open question.
I don't think it is.
I don't think it is either, but we don't know. Well, and a lot of the coupling with the radiation problem from heavy ion exposure couples to a lot of the other problems, like whether cognitive effects of being cooped up for a long time, cardiovascular risks. That kind of radiation is also not studied at all. So there's just these really open questions that affect the ability of the crew to perform the mission that I think, given the way NASA works, no one is going to send people out before doing the expensive and long research to answer them.
One of the things that makes my head explode is that they haven't been doing before and after DNA testing. And I just saw an experiment in an email. I think they're going to start doing this now, but to look at how did radiation affect your DNA? Because that's how you get cancer. That's how you have a lot of problems that happen. Or maybe it's not radiation. Maybe it's just weightlessness. Maybe all this fluid, additional pressure in your head might kill DNA or change your DNA. Or what's it like to live in a CO2 soup for 6 months? Because I did. And is that going to affect Alzheimer's? Am I going to get
Yeah.
dementia sooner after breathing CO2? Because the CO2 levels are really, really, really high.
Right.
That makes you crabby and it reduces your cognitive. I can tell you it does.
Hmm.
But what are the effects of that? And I don't know that we know that. But it's the before and after. In my mind, it's radiation. That's the biggest thing, which
Yeah.
is why I don't think we should go to Mars until we have an electric propulsion system, which requires nuclear power. Which, by the way, you can't go to Mars without nuclear power anyway
Right. Some form. Yeah.
to run the crew compartment on the surface. But that would, if it worked, it would allow you to get there and back in 1 year instead of 3 years.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that's my take on it anyway.
I find it hard to disagree with. I did want to mention, I don't know if you're familiar with the non-targeted effects, that phenomenon with heavy ion radiation.
Mm-mm.
This is really weird stuff. It's kind of like if your neighbor got hit by a bus and then you ended up having to go to the hospital. Um, our standard model of radiation is that a particle just goes through and it breaks stuff along the way, or maybe it creates highly reactive chemicals near the DNA.
Mm-hmm.
The non-targeted effects are a little bit different. What you see is that far out, like 2 or 3 or 10 cell lengths away from the track of the particle, you see the same sort of damage. The hypothesis is that there's chemical signaling pathways that get messed up by the
Huh.
damage on the track that affect the neighborhood. And some of these effects are called abscopal. They happen far away. People have been seeing this with radiation treatment for cancer. Like in the 50s, you would irradiate someone's tumor here and the tumors here would shrink. So that the hypothesis there is that it's immune system mediated. And as you know, the immune system also changes a lot in space. So there's this kind of like spooky action at a distance that is especially important for heavy ion radiation that is just beginning to be studied on Earth, where we haven't really had the facilities to shoot the right kinds of ions at the right speeds,
Mm-hmm.
even at mice. And that's also like, that's the reason I concentrate on the heavy ions is because of that whole aspect of things where the low dose chronic radiation, according to our model, shouldn't be terrible. But if our model is wrong and things happen off the particle track as well to tissues, then it turns out the risk is quite a bit higher. And kind of constraining that risk is one of the big things that would have to be done on Gateway or on the lunar surface, somewhere
Mm-hmm.
outside the magnetosphere, whether in animals or in the poor astronauts who volunteer to go. And that also adds years to the prep time, you know?
Right. That's interesting because the ISS does have some shielding.
Mm-hmm.
It's got Earth, so half of the sphere is
Yeah, you got a
shielded
big
by
rock right there, kind of.
Earth is a good blocker. And it is mostly under the magnetic radiation or the
Right.
magnetic field. I wrote a chapter in my book about seeing white flashes, which I remember the first time I was on the shuttle, I was going to sleep and poof, I saw this
Yeah, I
white
was going to
flash.
ask you if you had
Yeah.
seen those.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And it's just galactic cosmic radiation, this really high
Mm-hmm.
energy particle hit my optic nerve and sent an electric signal to my brain. And I thought, cool. And then I was like, oh, if there's one of those hitting my optic nerve, there's 1,000 others hitting other parts of my body. And I got basal cell skin cancer after both of my space flights. So
Oh, wow.
and I don't know, who knows? And the doctors
Right.
were like, well, you don't know where that came from. And they're right. But it's weird that I got them after both of my space flights and I was fine
Right.
before that. Anyway, I think radiation is the big risk. Let's talk. I know we're running out of time. Let's talk about Gateway real quick. What do you think
Yeah,
about
sure. Well, to me, Gateway makes sense if you're planning to go to Mars, you need someplace outside the magnetosphere to do these experiments. And you need a place where you can practice the long-term life support and the quiescence. Like it just sits there between visits. And so kind of my critique of Gateway is that it's another one of these things where you assume that human spaceflight is an important goal, and then what do you need to build to make that happen? I think that on its own terms, Gateway makes no sense at all. Like why in the 1960s did we just land on the moon, but now we need a stopover? So, and then there's what you alluded to is this idea of we need a destination for these spacecraft to go to that's other than the
Well,
ISS.
that's why it was built. We had
Mm-hmm.
Orion and we had SLS and we have partners, Europe, Japan, and they're not going to be building landers. They're not going to be building rockets, but they can build modules. And so that's why there's Gateway.
And so in some ways we're learning the wrong lessons from the space station. The approach to Gateway is like, let's take what worked on the space station and do it again, a little bit better. But
What do you call that?
um, like
Junior
the
ISS or Junior Space
oh
Station?
yeah, ISS Junior, right?
ISS.
Like so
I call
that's
it, people call it ISS 2.0. I call it ISS 0.5 because it's a lot smaller, but you call it ISS Junior. I like that.
yeah, but like the whole idea of modular space stations is more driven by politics and launch constraints than by
Right.
design. Like you
Right.
probably want just a big hulking cylinder or something. But this, the fact that it has the international partners that are mixed in, that's only done to make the budget harder to cancel and kind of to give it staying power. So it's this projection of NASA bureaucracy into space more than a spaceship that people thought like this is something we really need and we got to
Right.
get it up there.
A friend of mine who actually is a rocket scientist, got a PhD in astronautical engineering, and he's been trying to convince me. He's like, you need to watch. There's this hour video where an orbital mechanics guy it's internal. It's on the NASA website, internal firewall. But he's like, you got to watch it. There's a good reason, and you can maneuver it with very low energy and blah blah blah. But the bottom line is, you have to build it, and that costs a
Yeah.
lot of money, and then you have to maintain it. And then if you're going to the moon, you have to go there first and then land. And that adds weeks to your trip. Like the astronauts are getting
Right.
irradiated for weeks. And, but you can have like a propellant depot. Well, that's true. But like you have to launch the propellant from Earth and maintain
Right.
it. It has things, but it doesn't just exist on its own. You have to pay for those things, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
and it's eating your budget for years to come,
right.
that you're already struggling to fit into.
Absolutely. I half jokingly said if we could build Gateway and then just abandon it, that would be fine. But the real problem with Gateway is that we have to keep on operating it,
Uh-huh.
which A, costs money to operate it, and B, constrains us. And the other thing is, I look at the moon as a test ground for Mars, and Gateway is more like it makes the moon the destination, which the radio telescope on the far side,
Mhm.
that would be the discovery possibility there would change our understanding of the universe. But and if you could mine helium-3 or elements for fusion on Earth, that's another potential really valuable thing. I've heard there's other commercial uses of the moon, but for the most part, I look at it as a testing ground. And the way we're exploring the moon is not how we're going to explore Mars. For example, you're not going to bring a 50,000-pound Orion capsule, I don't think, to Mars. Right? You're probably going to like
Right.
stop in Earth orbit and then launch a capsule to bring the crew the last couple 100 kilometers.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not how we're exploring the moon. We're exploring the moon the way we're exploring moon. And so in other words, we're not going to learn anything for Mars from the current plans to explore the moon, just because they're not designed in the same way we're going to design the Mars exploration. That's my view.
And there's a threat to build a Martian gateway too. Some of the mission designs have another gateway in high Mars orbit that,
Mhm.
yeah. So if you're not a gateway fan, it's getting scary.
But you can control the robotics. I know my scientist friends, their heads literally explode whenever someone says, but you can do robotics from Gateway. They're like, well, I can do robotics from my office in
Right.
in Houston or JPL. But anyway, yeah, I'm not. But it is what it is, and it's just not going to change. So we could talk about it.
Yeah, it's the thing I wish would change is the space program is so timid right now. Like if you're I'm against human space flight, but if you're gonna do it, like do it for real. We're kind of doing this reenactment of the moon landings.
Yeah,
It's on a schedule of years between launches. There's no plan or rationale for why to do it other than to show that we can. There's these extraneous moving parts like Gateway. I would really like to see, if people are going to do human spaceflight, picking a goal that only people can achieve. Your example of repairing the Hubble was great. If we built a capability to go to Webb and
yeah.
fix it, or to build a astronomy stuff on the moon or at the Lagrange points or somewhere, and a capacity to go there, that would, I might not support it, but I would see the logic. But this is kind of what's the minimum human spaceflight program we can skate by on to keep the ability to go into space? And I think that just makes nobody happy, even the astronaut corps.
There's 10 NASA centers in a lot of different congressional and Senate districts.
Yeah.
I saw there was a vice president tweeted out about Orion years ago that Orion is being built in all 50 states. And when I saw that tweet, I thought
Right.
I would cancel that program tomorrow. Dragon
Right.
Dragon is built in one state. Like they build
Right.
everything in California.
Right. Nothing should be built in Alaska or Wyoming for space
That's the
flight.
most inefficient
Yeah.
possible thing. Um, so it's kind of the self-licking ice cream cone, but
Mm.
it is what it is. Mike Griffin is a good friend of mine. He's one of the smartest human beings I've ever talked to, and he loved being NASA administrator. He actually Constellation. To your point, if you're going to do it big. I think Constellation was right. It came up with a goal. They built architecture that made sense in some ways. And anyway, and I said, why don't we shut down this center, that center? And he's like, Terry, the president could do that. And it would take all of his political capital and make a bunch of people mad. And, the political realities, to your point, you open up your article with the Feynman quote about physics has to take precedence over, public relations or politics. Yeah. But the reality is there's no bucks, no Buck Rogers, and in order to get bucks, you have to keep the politics happy. So Mike I think he had a great plan of trying to get the most value given the political constraints that you operate in. Mm-hmm. And now with guys like Jeff Bezos, he has some spare change in his couch. He can fund things. Yeah. There are private astronauts to the outer or missions to the outer planets. A former astronaut friend of mine is actually running a deep space mission, private mission, $200 million from one of these billionaires that wants to fund exploration, which I think that's pretty intriguing.
That is pretty intriguing. Actually, that makes me want to ask you your opinion on Starship and its prospects, this incredibly large rocket.
They're firing it up today. I'm not exactly sure what time, but today they're doing the 31 engine test. I mean, look, I'm not going to bet against Elon, and if he can get it operating, that's great. Reusing first stage engines on the Falcon 9, it works. It makes sense. It takes, some percentage of the cost out of the rocket, but reusing a second stage, that's the space shuttle was the second stage, and that's much harder, much more expensive prospect. The rocket is incredible. It's 10 million pounds or something. It's a huge, massive rocket. And I was just involved. I've been doing some consulting projects, looking at SLS, looking at Starship and stuff. If he gets even close to what he's promising, it's going to be really hard to justify SLS, because he's promising much lower costs. So I guess I'll have to wait and see. I'm not going to bet against Elon. Having 31 engines work all at the same time is a tough thing to do. The Soviets tried it. They blew that N1 rocket up several times. So I don't know. Hopefully it works. Hopefully we have a heavy lift rocket for $100 million or a couple hundred million. I mean, that enables stuff. And it's not only human. Imagine if all these probes going to Jupiter and deep space could be launched on a Starship. They would get there 5 years quicker.
Yeah, you wouldn't have to do 17 gravity assists.
Go by Venus and Mercury and Mars on your way to Neptune. So you could, and instead of doing one flagship mission a decade, you do one a year, that to me is really exciting. I think that's one of the possibilities. I think putting 100 people in there and floating around the moon is like the design for their HLS, the moon landing system, HLS, Starship HLS, is the SpaceX won the competition because they were by far the closest to being ready, and also by far the cheapest, which is why they got picked. But they have to launch some number of these Starships in Earth orbit to refuel the moon lander.
Yeah, I think they need 5 launches to refuel the one that goes up. And nobody's ever refueled anything in space. Just let's put that out there.
Right. So a lot of stuff has to happen. And a company called Axiom that I love, it's run by Mike Suffredini. They have some really great people, but they're building the space suit for the moon landings. They've never built a spacesuit before. So there's a lot of long poles in this tent. A lot of them are being done for the first time. And as you know, maybe this will be the first time a program works on time and on budget, but we have about 1,000 data points that normally doesn't happen.
And the HLS it's also landing 1950s style, like a big pointy thing on
It's
its tail.
it's like this.
Yeah.
It's
And
crazy. And then to walk up that you're going to be, even though it's 1/6 gravity, that's
yeah, I
going to
want to
be,
know who gets the contract for the rope ladder. It's going to be
yeah,
a $2 billion rope ladder,
it'll
and
be,
I would be
yeah,
fascinated to
exactly.
hear how that's built.
Exactly. So I don't know. The people that I talk to on the inside know that it's going to take longer than we think, but I don't know. I hope it works. I'm interested to see the results from today.
Me too. And I'm trying not to fall into this trap of being negative about everything. Like
Yeah.
if we can revolutionize getting stuff to low Earth orbit, that's awesome. I got my
Yeah.
fingers crossed for Starship.
Yeah.
But I just don't want 30 more years of what we've had as kind of this drip by drip space program that doesn't realize, I'm getting older. I had dreams as a kid of seeing
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
cool
I
space
know.
things. I want to see this happen.
Well, I know. We'll see where it's going. There's a lot of interest in space. There is a lot of activity in space. The massively ballooning deficit that we've had in the last 5 years is it's just not going to help. The
Yeah.
discretionary spending, and with interest rates going up, discretionary spending is not going to be growing in the future.
Yeah.
So we're going to have a public-private partnership, and do things as efficiently as we can. I hope we send the probe to Europa. I really want to see Europa. I hope we
Mhm.
send it to the gas giant planets. Those moons are super cool.
Yeah. Yeah. There's now 4 that have an ocean, possibly 5 if you count
Really?
Midas. So, yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean,
Callisto,
that's amazing.
Ganymede. Yeah. I
Now
know. I know.
they're freaking cold. They're like hundreds of degrees below zero.
Yeah. So you have like kilometers and kilometers of ice, but like you said, you
But
stick
when you
that
go down, it gets warmer.
self-heating
Yeah.
rod. Right. Right.
Right. Right.
And Callisto in particular has stuff erupting out from the liquid layer. So you can even just look at the contents of the plumes and maybe find biosignatures. So that's
Right.
really
You could
exciting.
fly a probe through those plumes, which would
Yeah.
be cool. And Io has amazing volcanoes. It's the most volcanic place. Anyway, the solar system is cool. I hope we
It's pretty great. I'm glad we live here. Right in the
Earth.
middle of all these great planets.
Exactly. Um, it's a great place to visit, but I wouldn't want to live there. Earth is a great place to live. So anyway, Maciej, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This was great.
Thank you for having me. I really had a great time.
This was a lot of fun. And again, if you like the podcast, please subscribe and give us a rating.